Welcome back to another episode of your Small Town Pastor Podcast. I am your host, Shane Tarpley, and today we are going to dive into a subject and a conversation that plagues so many pastors. If you'll recall last podcast, we talked about why people leave the church, and we talked about what people need as far as who they are and how we can just pastor people better. So today, I want to talk to you about controlling conflict. Controlling conflict. Now, most pastors I know avoid conflict with like the plague. They absolutely hate conflict. But today I thought I would give you some measurements and some practical tools on how to control the conflict. So let's jump right in. We are on season 2, episode 3 of Small Town Pastor Podcast. Okay, we're back, and let's dive into controlling the conflict. If you have your coffee, sit down and get ready to take some notes. Ephesians 4:3 tells us that we ought to make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Now, what does that mean? Because nothing will disrupt what God wants to do in our churches like disunity, especially within our leadership culture. And listen, Pastor, if you don't have a leadership culture established, if you don't have a leadership team or a leadership pipeline, that's got to be a place that you start, because you can't have accountability and resolve conflict and all of that stuff and move the vision forward without proper leadership. And so that's got to be the first place that you start. Because conflict, listen, is not the absence of unity. I know a lot of people run from conflict. They avoid it at all costs, but it's actually an opportunity for unity. Come on, conflict is not the absence of unity. It's an opportunity for unity. It's not a fake it until you make it concept. Conflict is real, and sometimes healthy confrontation needs to happen. So I want to give you 2 ways that we can respond to our conflict. Number 1, the first way is to overlook minor offenses. 1 Peter 4:8 tells us to love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. So we've got to learn how to fill the gap with trust. We've got to learn that the conflicts we experience are often just sometimes people having a bad day. It could be a cultural difference. It could be a miscommunication. It could be a misunderstanding. Listen, I can tell you, Pastor, that misunderstanding and miscommunication are the world's worst enemies when it comes to establishing your leadership culture. Not everything is really that important. We'll discuss in other episodes the difference between urgency and importance. And what's important is not always urgent, but sometimes those things that are urgent, we neglect because we don't think they're as important as something that we have established as a priority. So not everything is really that important. So I want to encourage you, stop being offended about everything. And I want to tell some of these leaders that may be watching this, you've got to stop letting yourself be offended about everything. Not everything is a mountain worth dying on, is a hill worth dying on. So you've got to learn to pick and choose your battles. So we've got to, first of all, learn to overlook the minor offenses. Stop being nagging. Stop being nitpicky. Just let people be. But there are cases where you are going to have to make confrontation. You are going to have to create conflict because, contrary to popular belief, conflict is not bad. Sometimes conflict is actually necessary in order to make things healthy again. So let's talk about when not to overlook offenses, when not to overlook these conflicts. So here's the thing. Is this behavior part of a destructive pattern? Do they have a victim mentality? Are they an avoider? Are they a people pleaser? Are they people who would rather you just leave them alone, but you can tell like every person that they have had around them tends to be negatively affected by their behavior and their attitude and their patterns? So is their behavior part of a destructive pattern? If it is, then you've got to address it. The second thing that we ought not to overlook is the conflict or behavior hurting other people. Are they snippy? Are they not a team player? Are they shutting other people down? Are they wishing that you would just leave them alone because they don't like accountability? Are they constantly complaining? Come on, that's a big indicator. Do they have a pessimistic attitude about things? Are they gossiping about other people? Those are things that we just cannot allow in our churches, Pastor. Gossip will literally shred every ounce of culture that you have established in a second. What took you 10 years to build can literally be over in 5 minutes if you allow gossip to continue. So you've got to train and raise up the right leaders. And pastor, you've got to be willing to confront that gossip head on. When people are making false accusations based on no evidence of your behavior or what they don't like about the culture or what they don't like about your church, and they just come in and you can tell that their sole agenda was just to pick it apart, you've got to be the one to confront that. The next thing is it hurting the offender? Matthew 5:23 tells us this: you suddenly remember a grudge a friend has against you. Abandon your offering, leave immediately, go to this friend and make things right. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to be willing to confront that conflict that is like the elephant in the room. It's like everybody knows it's there, but nobody wants to address it. Nobody wants to point it out. Nobody wants to go say, excuse me, Mr. Elephant, could you please move your big fat behind out of the way because it's causing a disruption in our church and our organization. So you've got to be the one. Ultimately, those are just things that you just cannot delegate. Is it significantly dishonoring God and or dishonoring the body of Christ? Things like gossip. You've got to be willing to make things healthy. Sometimes a brother or a sister who has a bad spirit, a bad attitude, will have to be redirected and corrected. And if they are not submissive to the authority of the house, then they will have to be dismissed from that position. If they continue to sow discord and toxicity within the organization, within specifically the church, because that is a spiritual connotation, then they will have to be removed altogether. Now, I can't tell you the last time I was in a church that actually had to remove someone from their congregation. But occasionally it does happen, and some people will just have to be okay with you not being their pastor because they don't like the culture or the trend that you're setting. So is it dishonoring God? Is it dishonoring the body? The next thing is the conflict or the situation damaging your relationship with this person? Look, we've got to fight at all costs to keep relationships healthy by addressing the issues, not avoiding them. A lot of people think, well, if I never address it, if I never have to have this confrontation, if I never have to have a conflicting moment with this person, then everything will just go back to the way it was. But unfortunately, that's just not the case, and it never will be the case. The more you avoid it, the worse it's going to get. It's like a festering sore. If you don't rip off and clean it up and apply the antibacterial ointment or the Neosporin or whatever the case is, or the peroxide to clean it, or just pouring straight isopropyl alcohol right smack dab on the wound, it's not going to get better. You're in charge of that, pastor. You've got to take your courage back. Come on, courage over conflict. That's what I want to leave you with right here. So you've got to have what we like to call in our organization courageous conversations. And we got that term from one of my coaches, who has an incredible coaching network, Sean Lovejoy. He's not paying me to say this, but if you need a coach, a pastoral coach, organizational leadership coach, you got to check out Sean Lovejoy. Maybe we can even have him as a guest on our podcast. That would be absolutely amazing. It would make my day. But you've got to have a courageous conversation. You've got to remember the defenders of the peace are willing to fight for it. But those who don't want peace and don't care about your organization, they don't care about the vision, they will continue to push against it at all costs, to make their point of view, to make their perspective seen and heard, no matter what. So it's your job to declare and to raise up defenders of peace and unity, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. You've got to have face-to-face or phone-to-phone conversation. Don't try to resolve conflict through text messaging. Confrontation through text messaging never works because you can never tell someone's tone. Listen, I'm a very direct person when it comes to text message. A lot of my leaders are. And if I base their directness and their straightforwardness, and if they based mine off of my text messages, they would think I was upset at them all the time, but that's just not the way we operate. So it's always best to do face-to-face, one-on-one, resolve the issue, and move on down the road. We've got to learn to pastor or lead people through their conflict because they're only going to see it one-sided. They're only going to see their point of view. We've got to help them understand the broad picture here. What's really at stake is not just their perspective. What's really at stake is not just their preference or their comfort level. If they're going to be on the team, they've got to be willing to play ball. And then we've got to help them understand that really what they're conflicting about is really not that big of a deal, but sometimes that's very hard. It's like telling somebody who's angry to calm down. You've got to find the right time. You've got to find the right way to say it, or it's just not going to work. So listen, Philippians 2:3 tells us this: in humility, value others above yourself, not looking out for your own interests, but each of you looking out for the interest of others. Matthew 18:15 tells us this: if a fellow believer hurts you, go and tell them. Work it out between the two of you. If he listens, you've made a friend. If he won't listen, take one or two others along in that presence of witnesses, and they'll keep things honest, and then try again. 2 Corinthians 2:9-11. I'm giving you these scriptures for validation on what we just talked about. Anyone you forgive, I also forgive. And what I have forgiven, if there was anything to forgive, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake, in order that Satan might not outwit us. Come on, pastors. How many of us are being outwitted by the devil himself? For we are not unaware of his schemes. So the way to start a conversation about conflict is go to that person and just be completely transparent. Just say, hey, this is really hard for me, but I need to talk to you about this. And don't beat around the bush. Lay it out straightforward, put it out on the table, and then unpack it and figure out how you can reach a resolution. And sometimes the best way to resolve peace is to agree to disagree and part ways and move down the road. So you've got to ask yourself, what are you fighting for? Is what you're fighting for worth it? Because we're fighting for peace in our hearts. First of all, Pastor, you need to lay your head down at night knowing that you did the absolute best job you could with what God has entrusted you to do, with who he's called you to be, and be okay with that. Be comfortable in your skin. Be comfortable in the way you are, because what you're doing right now is a spiritual battle. It is not a battle against flesh and blood, and we have to remember that. There is always an adversary behind the conflict that is trying to stir up trouble. All of this, do everything, the confrontation, make sure that it's bathed in love, bathe it in prayer, spend time praying and fasting. Look, when Jesus' disciples were trying to cast out this demon one time, they came to Jesus and said, why can't we cast this out? We tried to do it in your name. And Jesus said, this only comes out through prayer and fasting. So you've got to make sure that everything you do is bathed in love, prayer, and fasting, because we're not fighting against each other. We're fighting against a common enemy. And until we learn this, pastors, that we're not fighting against other people. We're not fighting against the church down the road. We're not fighting against our elders or our deacons or, that loose cannon that seems to, want to stir up trouble and strife. We're not even fighting against them. We're fighting against the adversary that is provoking them. And so we've got to understand that when the church moves forward, it changes people's lives. And when people's lives get changed, it changes a community. It's like throwing a rock in a pond, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So the rock in the pond, or a boulder in a lake, or an earthquake in an ocean, which one do you want? Because it is going to get there. Don't be afraid of the conflict. Don't avoid it. Don't run away. Defend the peace, defend the unity, and raise up a culture of accountability. So I hope you enjoyed this. Until next time, this is your Small Town Pastor podcast, hoping and helping you to get better where you are. Love you guys. Have a great day.